Mahagat Las Cairlig agus Bavralim Falcha Curra Rivanara. Minister, you're very welcome.
Talk no media.
Okay, good Mahagat. And to thank you for your good work, Minister, and your hard work indeed in the context of these negotiations in particular. The good news for Ireland, as is well known, is that our portion of the budget, the national allocation, so-called, will remain broadly the same under the reformed Common Agricultural Policy. The key changes being on how the money is distributed, and that's what much of the debate here will be focused on, understandably. The Commission has promised us, Minister, a more efficient CAP by simplifying administrative mechanisms without losing efficiency, and I think all farmers will welcome simplification of the processes involved and less red tape, hopefully. However, the new CAP makes significant changes to the distribution of single farm payments, affecting thousands of Irish families over the next 7 years. And broadly speaking, like others, I would welcome the changes that have been made. I come from a small farming background myself, but I do see that there is a need to, if you like, protect life on the land and to protect rural communities, but there's also a need to protect sustainable productivity. Under the new system, support will be calculated on a per hectare basis rather than linked to past productivity, and the new CAP will see a number of countries, including eastern countries such as Romania and the Baltic states, receiving an increase in their entitlements as countries are brought towards a minimum payment. And now, for the first time, it has to be said, the greater part of EU money will flow eastwards as opposed to going towards traditional recipients here in Ireland. But broadly speaking, it's very much to be welcomed that most of our allocation has been protected. Within individual member states, countries will have to change the way they distribute payments, and through this process called internal convergence, the report states that farmers will be entitled to a minimum level of payment. And I note what you've said in your speech, Minister, though I wasn't here to hear you. It is the case that about half of Irish farmers who are currently on higher payments will see a dip, while a slightly larger number, around 60,000 farmers who are currently below the average, will see their payments increase. There are we await further details on how member states will manage the various rural development schemes, the Pillar 2 aspects, which of course also form part of the Common Agricultural Policy. And I would like to join the call made by the IFA, Minister, that the Government should commit to 50-50 co-financing of Pillar 2 schemes, so that we can have a comprehensive package of rural development measures put in place for vulnerable sectors and regions, and to encourage investment in agriculture. I note as well that member states or regions may grant additional payments for areas with natural constraints as defined under rural development rules of up to 5% of the national allocation. And this is optional, and it doesn't affect the options available under rural development. But I hope, Minister, that you can confirm that the Government will commit the maximum possible to assist farmers in marginal areas. Could I take this opportunity, Minister, to raise the issue of the recent EU Commission deal with the Government of Canada on a common free trade agreement? On the 18th of October, as you know, the EU and Canada reached a political agreement on the key elements of a trade agreement called CETA, and we are told that this agreement will remove over 99% of tariffs between the two economies and create sizable new market access opportunities in services and investment. Now, it should be noted that until the agreement is approved by the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, it won't come into effect. It seems to me here that the concern I would have is that perhaps the EU traded away some of its, and by extension our, Irish agricultural interests in order to protect other interests that the EU has. In 2012, Canada was the EU's 12th most important trading partner, Minister, accounting for 1.8% of the EU's total external trade. In the same year, the EU was Canada's second most important trading partner, after the US, with about 9.5% of Canada's total external trade. So unsurprisingly, Canada is more reliant on the EU than vice versa. And thus it would have appeared to any observer that the EU would hold and have held the senior position in the negotiations. If we look at the deal that was done, the pact would eliminate tariffs on almost all goods and services, set larger quotas for EU dairy exports, and make it easier for EU car makers to export vehicles to Canada and for European companies to invest in Canada's uranium sector. And I can certainly see the benefit, as quotas go in dairy, for example, for export of dairy products from the EU and from Ireland. But for Canada, pork and beef farmers would appear to be the biggest winners. They have gained a bigger share of a huge market once they change production and processing to meet EU rules. I think as far as Canada is concerned, we can say that a powerful producer is gaining powerful access to EU markets. The EU will eliminate duties on a range of Canadian agricultural products, from wheat to maple syrup. Canada will be able to export 80,000 metric tonnes of pork and 50,000 metric tonnes of beef, free of duties, to the EU. And Canadian cattle ranchers are gearing up to export an additional 426 million of beef annually into the EU from 2015. Significantly, Minister, there is no limit on the value of the cuts that are exported. Thus, it's reasonable to assume that Canadian exporters will target the higher end of the market with select cuts and stakes. And this fear was articulated by the Meat Industry Ireland group, who say that allowing the Canadians to cherry pick who said that it allowed the Canadians to cherry pick the EU beef and pig meat market by targeting higher value segments. And those producers are rightly concerned that the European Commission seem to use access to the EU meat market as a bargaining chip, thus sacrificing EU agriculture in trade negotiations for gains in other sectors of the economy. So could this deal undermine European beef prices if Canadian beef processors target the lucrative EU steak cuts market? The ICSA beef chairman, Edmund Phelan, said, and I agree with him, that while the likelihood in this deal, the likelihood in this deal was that there would be more pain than gain for Irish farmers. Now, if we contrast that with what the Canadian beef farmers are saying, they're describing it as a really good outcome for Canada's 80,000 cattle farmers. So CETA is the first trade deal that EU has done with a G8 country, and it's widely regarded as a scene setter for trade talks underway between the EU and the US. And that is what I want to ask you about, Minister. Is there a danger, and if there is, I think it must not happen, that the Commission might repeat the agriculture market access concessions to Canada in its forthcoming negotiations with the USA? I'd very much welcome your response on that. We can't know what negotiations are ongoing with the USA because, like all free trade negotiations conducted by the Commission, the EU-Canada negotiations were held in secret and as I would say, arguably were driven by Canadian and European big business that want market access rather than certainly the concerns of maintaining rural communities or our interests in the beef markets. So I agree with the IFA that this government must be a strong voice in Europe to resist pressure to liberalise trade for sensitive products such as beef and pig meat. The WikiLeaks cables showed the enormous pressure that US diplomatic service is exerting to compel one-sided deals in which large volumes of beef and pig meat and other agricultural products of dubious quality are imported into the EU while they offer very modest market access for EU exports. Minister, the government must insist that any imports from Canada fully meet EU standards on production, food safety and the environment, which, remember, these standards put significant costs of production on Irish farmers. And finally, Minister, I'd ask what assurances can you give the House that as part of the implementation of this agreement that those farmers who are affected will be able to avail of supports at either EU or local level? In Canada, the Economic Development Minister said that, and I quote him, "We have commitments from the federal government to address the potential negative cost and economic impacts to the dairy, specifically to cheese producers." Are there similar commitments and will there be similar protections for Irish farmers, Minister? Gurmil Mahagan.